Watch what the residents of the central districts did before any official warning was issued, because the residents of the central districts had already learned what the warnings would eventually confirm. By the time the first formal alert reached the public channels, the parking garages beneath the residential towers in the affluent neighborhoods nearest the river had already filled with vehicles whose owners had developed, across the preceding months, a private intuition about when the night was about to become something other than ordinary. Phone calls were being made to family members in the outer districts to confirm shelter arrangements. The internal messaging applications that the Russian authorities have spent considerable effort attempting to monitor were carrying patterns of activity that the monitoring services would later have to assess. None of this was the result of a leak from the air defense network or a tip from a sympathetic officer. It was the result of a population that had been learning across the preceding year that the assurances issued by the federal authorities about the security of the capital were assurances whose reliability had a half-life shorter than the speeches in which they were delivered. The civilians who acted before the alerts arrived were not better informed than the alerts. They had simply concluded that the system of alerts was not reliably ahead of the actual development of events, and they had adjusted their behavior accordingly. This is not a story about a Ukrainian retaliatory strike against Moscow. This is a story about what happens when the implicit contract between a population and the authorities responsible for protecting it begins to erode under sustained pressure, and how that erosion expresses itself in behaviors that the authorities are not positioned to control and that themselves become a strategic consequence of the operations producing them. I have spent decades watching how civilian populations respond to direct threat, and I want to be precise about something at the outset. The relationship between a population and its political authorities during wartime is not primarily a function of information. Populations under sustained threat develop their own information networks, their own pattern recognition, and their own assessments of authority reliability, regardless of what the official messaging environment is attempting to construct. When the official messaging diverges sufficiently from the lived experience of the threat, the population's behavior begins to be governed by the lived experience rather than the messaging, and the authorities responsible for the messaging lose a category of influence over the population that they had previously been able to assume. What unfolded over the Moscow region during the hours before dawn that morning is a case study in that loss of influence becoming visible across the metropolitan area. And by the time this analysis is finished, you will understand why the civilian response mattered more than any specific strike, why the political consequences extended beyond the physical damage, and why the most dangerous condition for any wartime government is not absorbing successful attacks. It is being seen by its own population to absorb them in ways that the official narrative cannot adequately explain. Let me be direct about the framing that the official Russian messaging will attempt to construct around the night in question, because the framing matters and it will be contested. The operation will be characterized as an act of terrorism conducted against civilian targets that the air defense system substantially defeated. Each element of that framing serves a specific political function. Characterizing the operation as terrorism rather than as a military strike against military and strategic targets is intended to delegitimize the operation in international forums and to consolidate domestic political support behind the leadership responding to it. Emphasizing civilian targets is intended to obscure the extent to which the actual targeting selection focused on military, industrial, and infrastructure objectives, whose damage produces operational rather than symbolic consequences. Asserting that the air defense substantially defeated the operation is intended to maintain the credibility of the defensive posture that the operation itself was specifically designed to test. The framing will be partially successful in the audiences that are politically aligned with the leadership constructing it. It will be substantially less successful in the population that experienced the night directly. And the gap between the official framing and the direct experience is one of the more important consequences of what occurred. Here is what the Ukrainian planning had actually been building toward in the period preceding the operation. And this is where the analysis begins to matter. The operation was conducted in the explicit context of recent Russian strikes against the Ukrainian capital that had produced civilian casualties, damage to apartment buildings, and the kind of imagery that propagated internationally regardless of the Russian information management apparatus's preferences. The Ukrainian political leadership had committed publicly to responses that would impose proportionate costs on the responsible party, and the operation was structured to fulfill that commitment in a manner that would be visible to the populations of both countries simultaneously. The drones committed to the operation were not a single category of platform, but a distributed mix, with longer-range systems targeting infrastructure and military objectives at the periphery of the capital region, intermediate-range systems engaging facilities within the metropolitan area, and shorter-range systems committed to demonstration strikes whose primary value was the public visibility of their arrival over the capital itself. The operation was, in operational terms, a strategic communication conducted through military means, and the communication was directed at audiences whose interpretation of the events would itself become part of the operation's effect. This is a principle that every serious student of modern strategic operations must internalize. A retaliatory strike derives its effectiveness from two things working together: proportionality and visibility. Remove either, and the strike fails to perform the communicative function for which retaliation is conducted. A strike that imposes substantial costs but is not visible to the populations whose responses determine the political consequences produces operational effect without strategic effect. A strike that is highly visible but does not impose proportionate costs produces strategic theater without operational substance, which is itself eventually recognized and diminishes the credibility of future operations. The Ukrainian operation that morning was clearly structured to achieve both, and the achievement of both is what differentiated it from operations that might have produced similar physical damage without producing comparable political consequences. The damage was substantial enough to be undeniable. The visibility was sustained enough to ensure that the population of the capital experienced the operation directly rather than learning about it through filtered official channels. The combination produced a category of effect that the Russian information management apparatus would have to contend with for some time, and that the residents of the affected districts would carry as direct memory regardless of the subsequent messaging. But this is only part of what made the night unusual. Because the Ukrainian operational planning had taken specific account of the conditions that would produce maximum civilian observation while minimizing civilian casualties, and the planning reflected the kind of careful target selection that the official Russian framing of the operation as terrorism specifically requires to be obscured. There is a distinction in modern strike operations between operations designed to produce civilian casualties as a primary effect and operations designed to produce strategic communication while accepting that some civilian impact is unavoidable. And the Ukrainian planning during this operation had clearly been operating on the latter principle. The targeting selection prioritized infrastructure whose damage would propagate through the metropolitan area's systems without producing concentrated casualty events. Strikes were conducted during hours when most civilian populations were in private residences rather than in workplace concentrations or public gathering areas. Flight profiles were structured to minimize transit over residential districts where structural damage from intercept debris would produce casualties unrelated to the target effects. None of this was visible in the Russian framing of the operation, because the Russian framing required the operation to be characterized in terms that justified the political response the leadership was preparing to deliver. The framing was constructed regardless of the actual operational profile, and the gap between the constructed framing and the actual profile is itself part of the strategic terrain on which the operation's effects will be contested. This kind of operation is harder to execute than its public characterization typically suggests, and the execution required levels of operational coordination that exceeded what most outside observers would have credited the Ukrainian system with before they observed the demonstration. Multiple launch sites had to coordinate timing across a target zone where Russian air defenses had been hardened specifically in response to previous Ukrainian operations. The flight paths had to be planned against the specific positions of Russian air defense assets that Ukrainian intelligence had been mapping across the preceding period. The control architecture had to manage the operation across sustained engagement, while Russian electronic warfare attempted to disrupt it. The Ukrainian command and control during the operation demonstrated the kind of integrated capability that has been developing across the program for some time. And the visibility of that capability to international observers became part of the operation's secondary effects. The Russian system was being shown in real time and to audiences worldwide that the Ukrainian deep strike program had reached a level of operational sophistication that exceeded what the previous public characterizations of the program had acknowledged. What happens during an operation of this kind reveals the structural relationship between physical effect and political consequence that traditional strategic doctrine has not adequately adapted to, and it deserves careful attention. The Russian air defense system did engage and intercept a substantial portion of the drones committed against the capital region. The interceptions produced their own visual signatures across the metropolitan area, with engagement events occurring above residential districts where residents could observe them directly. The combination of successful intercepts and successful strikes generated a composite experience for the population that the official messaging could not fully control. Residents saw interceptions and concluded that the air defense was active. They also saw or heard impacts that demonstrated that the air defense was not preventing all of the threats from reaching their targets. The official messaging insisting that the defense had substantially succeeded was being contradicted by the direct sensory experience of the population, whose confidence in the defense the messaging was designed to maintain, and the contradiction itself became a political reality that the leadership would have to manage independently of whatever the actual interception statistics turned out to be. And it gets worse from here, because the official Russian response to the operation when it was delivered in the hours that followed generated additional consequences that the response measures had not adequately weighed against the operational benefits. The promises of retaliation, delivered through the standard channels with the standard language, created expectations that the subsequent retaliatory operations would have to fulfill, regardless of whether the operational conditions for fulfillment were favorable. The characterizations of the operation as terrorism committed Russian diplomatic positions in ways that complicated subsequent negotiations on matters unrelated to the immediate operation. The internal security measures activated to identify potential collaborators and information leaks affected segments of the population whose response to those measures would itself become a political factor over time. Each element of the Russian response, considered individually, was a defensible measure within the doctrine of how states respond to such operations. Considered cumulatively, the response produced additional propagation of the operation's effects through the Russian political and social system in ways that the response itself was supposed to be containing. This is the doctrinal payoff I want every viewer to focus on, because it is the lesson that extends far beyond Moscow in this war. Strategic operations conducted against the capital regions of major powers are no longer primarily contests of physical capability. They are contests of political and informational management conducted through the medium of physical operations, and the side that better understands the political and informational dimensions can produce strategic effects that exceed what the physical scale of the operation would suggest. The damage produced by the operation that morning was significant, but not catastrophic in physical terms. The political and informational consequences of the operation will be more enduring than the physical damage, because they affected categories of asset that take longer to repair than buildings. The credibility of the air defense system among the population it was supposed to be protecting. The reliability of the official messaging among audiences who had been instructed to trust it. The implicit assurance that the security of the capital represented an inviolable component of the war's political architecture. Each of these had been quietly diminished by the operation in ways that the physical damage assessments will not capture, but that the political leadership will have to manage across the coming months. The fires have been extinguished. The damage assessments are being compiled. The retaliatory operations are being planned with the kind of urgency that the public characterization of the operation requires. The internal communications across the federal apparatus are addressing the operation with a level of seriousness that the public messaging will not reflect. But the questions raised by what occurred over the Moscow region before dawn that morning extend far beyond the immediate response measures, and they extend beyond this war. How many other capital regions, protected by other air defense systems, are currently being secured under the assumption that the political consequences of successful strikes against them can be managed within the existing framework of official messaging and information control? How many political leaderships are still calculating their resilience on the basis of the physical capability of their defenses rather than on the basis of the credibility their defenses can sustain when subjected to the kind of sustained pressure that modern strike operations can now generate? And how quickly can the lessons of those hours over Moscow be absorbed by the institutions and governments that will face similar conditions in the conflicts ahead before they discover, the way the residents of those central districts discovered when they began moving their vehicles before the alerts arrived, that the system of assurances they had been trained to trust had quietly become less reliable than their own direct experience of events, and that the war they thought their leadership was managing had become a different war that their leadership could no longer fully control.